Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal News video here on EternalTitans.com. Today I want to do something a little different. We just had the first big in-client Eternal tournament last weekend, the first official tournament from Direwolf side, which was pretty exciting, and there was a cut to top 32 and the top 32 was played out in full on stream on Sunday. And yesterday they posted the decklists, the metagame and everything from Sunday, so I figured I'll give you guys a breakdown of it, create some stats for it, and talk a bit about what happened. I figured Eternal News should be the best format for this, since it's kind of news in a way anyway, and I don't have another format that this fits in particularly well, and didn't seem necessary to create a new one. Alright, so let's dive right in. Okay, so first the metagame breakdown. The metagame was mainly comprised of base time decks. 65, almost 66% of the metagame, 21 decks were base time decks. I lumped together all decks that are heavy time basically. That consists of 14 traditional time mid-range decks, sort of your Sandstorm Titan mid-range decks, and 7 other time decks that are not necessarily playing Sandstorm Titan and not necessarily your typical mid-range deck, like Praxis Tokens or Combre Aggro, for example. The second biggest group of archetypes basically was harsh rule based control decks, mainly comprised of temporal control, as well as some Icaria black and blue. Then we have Icaria mid-range decks, which basically is just one archetype, it's just Recano Valkyries. And then we had one sort of loner that I didn't want to lump in with anything else, listed as other, which was basically a TJP Alessi deck, which is more kind of base Huru almost, and just splashing for a couple of time cards like Alessi, Student and Stand Together mostly. So yeah, that was the metagame. So that clearly shows that the most popular style of decks are all base time, which is not that big of a surprise with 2 of the most powerful new cards that we got from the last set were time cards in Teacher of Humility and Aurelian Merchant, and one of the most impactful and powerful units around since the beginning of the game has been Sandstorm Titan, and a lot of these decks play all 3 of those, or at least 1 or 2, or like 2 of those basically. Each of those decks has Aurelian Merchant, and most of them have either Titan or Teacher or both. And yeah, that makes for a very strong core of any deck really, and explains why they are so popular. Then we have the Harsh Rule control decks. Harsh Rule, another staple card that has been around since the beginning of the game, and a format and archetype defining card. And yeah, control is reasonably healthy and back again, as we can see, especially if you divide the time decks in 2 different archetype groups as time mid-range decks and more aggressive time decks. Then Harsh Rule control is right up there with the aggressive time decks. It might seem a bit, it might distort the picture a bit that I initially lumped in all time decks together, but that's why I broke them down underneath in addition. Alright, so yeah, the Icaria mid-range decks, that's kind of like the next pillar. Icaria, the other format defining and one of the most powerful units in the game since the beginning. And yeah, that provides a whole other new archetype in conjunction with the other powerful Justice cards, and even some of the control decks are Icaria based. So if you break down the metagame by Icaria decks, there's even 6 Icaria based decks. So we have like 7 Harsh Rule based decks that are also partially Icaria decks, and we have 6 Icaria based decks. And yeah, the other deck is just someone that decided to try something different. Alright, let's take a bit of a closer look at the archetypes. Okay, so as I said, we had the base time decks. The percentage here is wrong. I missed that, so ignore that. It's... oh, sorry about that. It is the 65.7 that I mentioned. Okay, first off we have the time mid-range decks. 14 out of those 21 decks were classic time mid-range decks. Most of those were some form of Praxis mid-range, either a Great Kiln Titan bigger Praxis variant, most likely running Lunar Magus and Great Kiln Titan usually, or the more traditional time mid-range decks, Praxis mid-range decks that top out at Heart of the Vault and a couple of Carnosaurs usually, or Kerasaurs. The other time mid-range decks, the second most popular one was Big Combre, also providing a bunch of copies, and then we had a couple of big Elysian decks in there, like 2 I think, but we'll get into that further, and 1 Xenon Killers even. So there's still some diversity in the time mid-range decks, but the most popular flavors are clearly Praxis and Combre, which makes a lot of sense. Elysian and Xenon have a lot less to offer. I think it's fairly established by now that Primal and Shadow are among the weakest colors and need some help, and we will see some of that support in the new campaign, as we already saw by some of the spoiled cards being appealing. Shadow and Primal cards, like the 2 most interesting cards, or 2 of the most interesting cards in the campaign are Shadow and Primal. There's the breakdown. 8 Praxis midrange. This is lumping together both variants. 3 big Combre decks. Then we have the other time decks, mostly comprised of Combre aggro. I lumped together 3 typical Combre aggro decks, as you saw them in my deck tag and my team play in the ETS the weekend before. But what you also see in here is one sort of a bit bigger, rampier type of aggressive Combre deck, that Knife Bloom Blade, that is kind of its own thing, but it's still sort of more or less a Combre aggro deck, so I put it in there, and I also included the TJP Alessi deck here, since it is also an Awakened Student aggro deck. I basically lumped together all Awakened Student decks, even though I listed the Alessi deck as other in the breakdown, since it's not a base time deck. But in regards to Combre aggro, to like Awakened Student based aggro, the TJP Alessi deck goes in here. And the rest of the time decks were 3 Praxis tokens decks. Okay, and then we have the 3 Rakano Valkyries deck, which are half of the Icaria base decks and the only non-control Icaria base deck. That brings us to the Harsh Rule control decks, 7 in total. The most popular among them was 4 temporal control decks, one of which won the whole event. Definitely one of the top decks, but that's known for a while now. I mentioned this already in my deck tag, for example, that this is one of the tier 1 decks, and this tournament shows that this is the case, that this is one of the more popular and also one of the best decks in the format right now. And the other 3 Harsh Rule control decks were Icaria control decks, comprised of 2 Icaria black and 1 Icaria blue. So yeah, this is not that popular, so I lumped them together, and it still makes up for like the other half of the Icaria base decks. And now we get to the most interesting part. How did everything do? Let's look at win rates. So temporal control was not the most popular deck in the event, but it was by far the most successful. The 4 temporal players had a total combined record of 9 and 3, and temporal won the whole event. So temporal control is the biggest winner of this event in every way, winning the event and also performing the best. that is definitely something to keep in mind and another testament to the deck's strength. The second most successful archetype was Big Hombre. That is not a big surprise to me, ever since I discovered that the deck is good again and yeah, basically made it a tier 1 deck again. I felt like it's one of the best decks in the format, and that's still the case. It's also probably the time mid-range deck that is best against temporal control. It's still not great against temporal control. Maybe 50-50-ish, I'm not sure. I haven't tested it a ton, but the matchup felt very winnable, and I have around a 50% win rate over my 150 games that I played. I think I'm like 8-8 or might even be 8-7 or something. Like something around the 50% mark, which is pretty reasonable. And it's just a very powerful deck, a very well-rounded proactive deck, so it can just beat a lot of random decks very well and plays one of the most powerful cards in the format right now, Sword of Unity. The third most successful deck is another Combrei-based deck. As you can see, the Combrei colors are really shining since even Temporal is TJP, so it also plays Time and Justice, is Combrei Aggro. The deck really dominated the ETS 2 weekends ago, basically the breakout tournament, after my team and I worked on the deck. Kamado created the initial deck and I tuned it to the list that most of the team was playing and that Grimfan won the event with. And yeah, the deck has become a mainstay of Ladder and the format since then, and no difference here. The deck definitely took a bit of a dive since it became popular, since it has its issues and it has particular trouble against bigger time mid-range decks. Especially the big Combrei matchup seems to be pretty rough, and I assume that some of the losses of the Combrei Aggro players were to other big time decks, especially big Combrei players. That explains the lowered win rate. So while Combrei Aggro was the most dominant deck when it came out, even more dominant than big Combrei, I would argue, Combrei Aggro suffered more from like the metagame settling a bit and shaking out a bit, and big Combrei came out ahead because it is good against it, still decent against Temple, and also just a very powerful proactive strategy. Next we have Rakano Valkyries and Big Elysian as like the break-even decks. Rakano Valkyries, a very solid deck, but it lacks a bit in power compared to the decks that we talked about before this. Sure, Ikaria is very powerful, but it has a pretty weak merchant, the market is not that great. It has sort of like a proactive strategy, but is not that fast and that aggressive. The units are outsized by bigger time units, so if they can take away the advantage of your evasion by, say, a Sandstorm Scarf or a Sandstorm Titan, your units will be outclassed by theirs and so on. So the deck has its weaknesses, is still a pretty good deck as we can see, but I would say it's not quite on the same level as the other 3 decks that did better. And yeah, Big Elysian is a bit of an odd one. There were 2 people playing it. I think they both went 1-1, or one went 2-1 and the other one lost the first round. This is BBG's, Bruised by Gods, creation from quite some time ago. It's a very big take on the Elysian archetype, basically Hailstorm into the time part of the big Combrei game, and a couple of Channel the Tempest. Honestly, I don't really see why you would want to play Big Elysian over Big Combrei, and it also shows like Big Combrei just did better than Big Elysian. So I can only recommend, if you want to play a big time deck, play Big Combrei. That's your Mystic Ascendant deck to go to. Then we have Praxis Tokens. That deck didn't do too well, although I feel like the deck underperformed, since it is pretty good, but I guess it got held back by the 3 most the 3 decks that did the best. Temporal Control is definitely the hardest matchup for Praxis Tokens, and 1 or more Praxis Tokens players lost to Temporal players. The big Combre matchup is not that great. Like, unlike normally time mid-range decks are really good for tokens, but big Combre having Sword of Unity and really big units kind of flips that around a bit. Every time they just put a Sword of Unity on a Behemoth or a Mystic Ascendant that keeps growing, the game is sort of over, and the deck is not very good at dealing with Ascendant, so usually when it comes down the next turn you can just drop a Sword on it and go to town, and then you have so much health, including all the blockers and stuff that you usually have going, that you should not be dying at any possibility, basically. And the deck has like an access to 7 Sword of Unities between 3 in the main and 4 in a market. So yeah, that's part of what happened with Praxis tokens there. The same kind of with against Combre aggro. They have pretty big units, they are also aggressive, so they apply pressure to you, and they have Sword of Unity. Without Sword of Unity, Praxis tokens would be favored against Combre aggro probably, but the big aggressive units together with the sword are probably too much. But yeah, Praxis tokens still a pretty good deck. Even the matchup against Temporal Control is decent, like 40% or something I would guess. And it's really good against any non-Sword of Unity, non-Hailstorm deck basically, which is sort of the rest of the meta game. But yeah, the 2 Sword of Unity decks and the Hailstorm decks are problematic. At least the Hailstorm plus Harsh Rule type decks like Big Illusion might still be fine. Then we have Praxis Midrange, the biggest loser of the tournament. By far it was the most popular deck, and it had one of the worst win rates, awful conversion rate, 27%, 3 and 8 in record over 8 people, so that means like most players just went 0-1. One guy went 2-1, and one guy went 1-1, and the rest went 0-1. So the best performing guy made it into the top 8 at 2-1, and that was actually, to my surprise, Andreas with his Great Kiln Titan Lunar Magus version, so basically Jazz Jumbo Praxis as he calls it, or Big Praxis, or whatever you want to call it. I would just call it Big Praxis, analogical to Big Combre and Big Illusion. So yeah, that was the one that did the best, but even that only did well because it got the right matchups. Like, I looked at his matchups, and he beat in the one Illusion, the one Icaria Blue guy. Icaria Blue is pretty poorly prepared to deal with a big time deck between Dawnwalkers and all the value from Heart and Great Kiln Titan and Kerosaur. Seems like a nightmare for Icaria Blue, especially without having any way to shut down the Dawnwalkers. No good silence effects, no Statuary Maiden, nothing. So yeah, he just kind of like stomped a good matchup and then played against a regular Praxis midrange. And we all know, if you're slightly bigger than your opponent, you are heavily favored. So he just won there too, and then lost to... Let me check for a moment. Then he lost to a Rakano Valkyries player in Lysix. So yeah, the 2 of the 3 wins that Praxis midrange could muster was basically beating a smaller Praxis midrange and beating a very good matchup. And that were like pretty few and far between. So yeah, Praxis midrange was a terrible choice. I honestly am surprised why it was so popular. I was not a big fan of the deck recently. It just felt kind of mediocre and underpowered compared to decks like Big Combre, Combre aggro, even Rakano Valkyries or Temporal, or even Praxis tokens. Like, Praxis tokens seems like a much better Praxis deck to me than Praxis midrange. I tested it quite a bunch when Sunny started messing around with like other Inspire heavy Praxis midrange decks, and it just felt very mediocre. It didn't feel terrible, but it felt like it's more of a tier 2 deck at best. And yeah, Praxis midrange will probably be a lot less popular going forward now after such a poor showing and after so many bad matchups being popular and doing so well. Then we have the Icaria control decks. They went 1 and 3. So yeah, the one of the Icaria black guys managed to go 1 and 1, and the Icaria blue and the other Icaria black guy lost the first round. Icaria black definitely seems like the better choice than Icaria blue, since it at least has access to Statuary Maiden, which seems very important in such a time-heavy field. But all in all, if you want to play control, as you can see, you should be playing Temple Control, but that's also not a surprise to me. Temple Control has clearly been the best control deck for a while now, and we haven't seen a whole lot of Icaria Control doing well. It was still surprisingly popular on ladder because people like it, but it's not a particularly good and well-positioned deck, especially Icaria blue. Not sure why people still put it in their tier lists, even potentially as tier 1. It makes no sense. The deck is just underpowered and has a lot of problems, has a lot of things that it can't deal with. And yeah, even though the sample size here is clearly small, the data makes sense in context of the matchups. If you look at, say, Icaria blue against the decks that did well, they are all somewhere between bad and a nightmare of a matchup, basically. And then last but not least, we had one guy that came with Xenon Killers and went home after the first round, so 0% win rate. And yeah, that's the breakdown by win percentage. Sort of, if you want to look at it based on win rates, the tier 1 decks seem to be Temple Control, Big Combrei, and Combrei Aggro, followed by sort of like a tier 2 of Rakano Valkyries, Praxis Midrange, Praxis Tokens, some Icaria Control decks, and other Time Midrange decks, which makes a lot of sense since the other Time Midrange decks all seem inferior to Big Combrei. Praxis Tokens seems to be the weaker aggressive time deck compared to Combrei Aggro. Icaria Control seems the inferior control deck to Temple Control, and Rakano Valkyries seems like it might just be a bit too low on power level compared to the other decks. But I could be wrong, like Rakano Valkyries could still be a tier 1 deck. It's definitely somewhere between tier 1 and tier 2 in power level. And just maybe had a bit of a rough run, the sample size is small and everything, but it is very possible that it's just more of a tier 2 deck based on what I said, since it makes sense. I think if you look at the deck, the power level of the deck looks lower and less impressive than the power in the top 3 decks, Temple, Big Combrei, and Combrei Aggro. They have such a high card quality, they are so powerful, so proactive, or in the case of Temple Control, so powerful at being reactive, that it's just kind of a different level than what's going on in Rakano Valkyries, that kind of just curves out good but not great cards and hopes to get there with Icaria eventually. Okay, that's it with my analysis of the top 32 results of the Shadowfall test tournament. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I know that you guys really enjoyed my metagame breakdown that I did quite some time ago, so I hope you enjoy this as well. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like the video, and of course let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this, if you would want to see more of this in the future, how you felt about it, if there's anything that you would like me to include or address that I didn't, and so on. Just give me some feedback, give me some input, what you guys think, and also what you guys think of the results, the tournament and the metagame and the win rates and stuff like that. So yeah, let's have a cool discussion about all these things in the comments. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing to not miss out on future content like this and others. And of course, turn on the notification icon so you actually get notified when there's new stuff. Please also check out my social media, follow me there, Twitter, Facebook, and you can also follow me on Twitch if you want to catch me live streaming on a regular basis. Yeah. One last thing, if you want to support me or Eternal Titans, you can both donate. You can find the link in the description, as well as, of course, the simplest and free thing to support us is just whitelist Eternal Titans and YouTube, and just watch the ads to support the content. That's it for today. I thank everyone for watching. Hope to see you guys in the next video. This was Eternal News with a breakdown and analysis of the Shadowfall Test Tournament Top 32 cutoff. I am your host, Manu S, and I see you next time. Bye.